Today's lectionary passage was the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. It's the story of Jesus with his mother and his disciples attending a wedding in the town of Cana. I am calling it the best party ever. Let's take a look at the passage. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk, but you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Let's take a look at some background here. It starts off saying that on the third day, but that simply means Tuesday. Sunday was and is the first day of the week on the Jewish calendar, just as it is on ours. Jesus was well into his earthly ministry by this time. He'd already called his disciples to follow him, and they and he had been invited to the wedding. Finally, Cana is not far from Nazareth, where Mary lived. It's only a few miles. I'm going to propose that this story is a parable. Now you may recall from our study of parables that parable means the form or narrative structure of the story. Parable does not mean fictional. I'm not saying that Jesus didn't go to the wedding at Cana or didn't change water to wine. I'm saying that the form of the story is meant to drive home a point. Parables have a setup. It's the setting of the scene that directly leads to a resolution of the issue at hand, followed by a conclusion or a kind of punchline that communicates, although not always very clearly, what the teaching point is. And parables can have more than one teaching point, depending on the perspective of the hearer or reader. So let's go into a little more background. Why a wedding for Jesus' first miracle? And is the wine merely a beverage? Weddings were important to ancient Jews in a way that is not necessarily familiar to our modern ears. It goes all the way back to God's covenant with Abraham. In Genesis 22, God told Abraham, "I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice." Now the covenant with Abraham was a foundational or fundamental covenant of the Jewish people with God. They referred to themselves as children of Abraham. And so when God made this covenant with Abraham, he was making it with all of Abraham's descendants as well, that he promised would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. That promise was a fundamental way that the Jews understood their covenant with God. Establishing the promise was what God did. Taking the human steps to bring it to fulfillment, well, that was up to the Jews. And bringing forth children to be as numerous as the stars in the sky was blessed only after the mother and the father had first been united in marriage. Ancient Jews considered it a religious duty to marry and have children. It was their obligation under the covenant with Abraham. It was, after all, the means by which the covenant continued. So Jesus performed his first miracle, or sign, as John calls them, at a foundational event, a wedding of the covenant with God. Now, what about the wine? Is the wine simply a beverage to drink at a party? Well, as John points out, the jars in the story were large, 6 jars that held between 20 to 30 gallons each. Now, did Jesus turn water into wine? Well, the jars were empty when Jesus began. Jesus really started with nothing and wound up with wine. But the wine isn't just alcohol. In the Old Testament, an abundance of good wine is an eschatological symbol, a sign of the joyous arrival of God's new age. Both Amos and Joel use the image of the hills dripping with new wine to describe God's favor. The miracle at Cana is more than the first act in Jesus' ministry. It also stands as the fulfillment of Old Testament eschatological hopes, as the inaugural act of God's promised salvation. So let's do some math. So there's 6 jars, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Let's call it an average of 25 gallons per jar. That's 150 gallons of water that the servants fetched. By the way, they didn't do it quickly. Just try to imagine those servants schlepping these 6 jars down to the well, filling them up with 150 gallons, and then having to schlep them all back to the party. It was not a quick job. Now you have 150 gallons of wine. There's 128 ounces per gallon. That's 19,200 ounces. 19,200 ounces divided by, say, 6 ounces per cup. That's 3,200 cups of wine. That was a great party. And it's not just the wine that made it so. It was the best party ever because Jesus was there. So, let's go back and look at the structure of the story and see whether it fits that of a parable. Here's the setup. Jesus and his mother and his disciples are at a wedding where the wine runs out. Both the wedding and the wine are rich in religious symbolic value for the Jews. Mary tells Jesus the wine is gone. Jesus replies, essentially, and that is my problem, exactly how? But Mary simply tells the servants to do what Jesus says. Jesus is now on the spot. The setup is accomplished. Resolution. Jesus tells the servants to fill 6 jars with water, and they do. Jesus tells them to take some to the chief steward. Think of him as the head caterer. The chief is surprised that the wine is so marvelous, and he even commends the groom for it. Now note well, the chief doesn't think there's been any miracle. He doesn't know that the wine didn't start out that way and was in fact water just a moment before. He figures that the host had had this wine all along. What the chief steward found unusual was not the wine, but the groom's hospitality in saving the best wine for last. So is there a punchline? Jesus' disciples, well, the servants too, know that the groom isn't part of the picture. The disciples see that God's presence is truly among them in the person of Jesus. Jesus offers a new category of understanding reality, a new presentation of the fulfillment of the ancient covenant with God, a presentation so abundant it beggars description. So, the disciples believed in him. Author Mary Collins wrote of attending a Catholic Mass in Bologna, Italy. The church, she said, was very poor. Instead of the usual pews, the church had only cast-off chairs from school lunchrooms. The worshippers were mostly broken-down elderly men showing signs of alcoholism and disease and poverty, plus a few poor old women. She wrote, "The liturgy progressed as usual. The homily proclaimed the mystery of the Trinity as a mystery of divine love so limitless, it poured out even to the poor of Bologna. Then it was time for the offering. The ushers went forward, and we reached for our bundles of lira. Then the unexpected happened. The ushers also reached for stacks of bills, and they moved through the assembly making the church's offering. Later, on the street, we learned that the gifts of the poor were given weekly, a token of God's graciousness and eschatological fullness, something to celebrate the Lord's day. In the presence of Christ, not enough becomes plenty for all. In the presence of Christ, the ordinary becomes the extraordinary." If we are truly perceiving God's abundant grace, our response should be thankfulness and generous sharing. The wedding party found itself with so much wine that all they could have done was just give it away. Everything we have is a gift from God. Let us believe in Christ. We are the presence of Christ. Do we have plenty for all to give away in His name? Do we see all the people? We are the presence of Christ. Are we a people of God, by whom the ordinary becomes extraordinary? What will each of us do this coming week to signify the fulfillment of our new covenant with God in the person of Jesus Christ? Will others see Christ in us and believe in Him because of what we do?